The little girl had bruises under her sleeves that she kept pulling down every 30 seconds. She didn't ask for food. She didn't cry. She just stood in the middle of 200 soaking wet bikers and whispered 4 words that stopped the whole room cold. "We haven't eaten yesterday." Her brother couldn't look at a grown man without flinching. And the man standing right behind them, the one calling himself their father, had eyes like a dead highway at midnight, flat, patient, the kind of eyes that had done this before. What happened next inside June's diner would tear open a conspiracy buried under badges, barbed wire, and the silence of a town that had learned to look the other way. Dank. Hey, if you're just finding this channel, welcome. Stay with us all the way to the end because this story does not go where you think it goes. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We read every single one, and let's get into it. The rain came in sideways off Route 9 like it had a grudge. It had been building for 3 hours, the kind of storm that starts as a low-pressure system in your chest before the clouds even break, the kind that makes old men check their knees and dogs refuse to go outside. By the time the first fat drops cracked the asphalt outside Garlow County, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, and the temperature had dropped 11 degrees in 40 minutes. The Thunder Rooks had been riding since dawn. 212 motorcycles, mostly Harleys, a few Indians. One ancient Triumph that belonged to a man named Cord, who refused to explain why he still rode it when it broke down every 3rd week. They weren't a weekend club. They weren't hobbyists with corporate jobs who played outlaw on Saturdays. Most of them had come back from somewhere: Iraq, Afghanistan, county lockup, bad marriages, worse childhoods, and found that the only place the noise inside their heads went quiet was at 70 miles an hour with the wind hitting their face like a closed fist. Grant Maddox rode at the front. He was 43 years old and had the face of a man who had seen too many things he couldn't unsee. A scar ran from his left eyebrow down to his jaw. Not a bar fight scar, not a knife scar, but the kind of deliberate surgical thing that happens when someone means to mark you permanently. He never talked about it. Nobody asked anymore. His hands on the throttle were steady, even when the rain came sheeting across the highway hard enough to blur the lane markers, and the other Rooks held formation behind him. Not because of club rules, but because Grant Maddox had a quality that was impossible to name and easy to feel. The kind of calm that only comes from a man who has already survived the worst thing that can happen to a person and decided to keep going anyway. He'd been a combat medic, 2 tours. He still carried a field trauma kit in his saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth, maintained like a weapon. The storm got bad enough that visibility dropped to 20 feet, and Grant raised his fist. The column pulled off at the first lit sign they could find. June's Diner. Open 24 HRS. Hot coffee. The neon was half burned out. The parking lot was gravel and mud. The building itself was the kind of roadside institution that had probably been serving truckers and county workers since before most of the Rooks were born. Formica countertops, spinning pie displays, a jukebox in the corner playing something nobody had requested. 212 bikers dismounted in the rain. The sound was extraordinary. All those engines cutting at once, the sudden silence filled immediately by the hiss of rain on hot metal and the wet scrape of boots on gravel. They moved toward the building in a mass, leather, and denim, road wet and cold, and the diner's windows lit up with the heat of their bodies before the door even opened. The woman behind the counter, June herself, mid-50s, gray streaks and dark hair, the efficient movements of someone who had been on her feet since before sunrise, looked out at 200 people pushing through her door and did not panic. She pulled a second coffee urn from under the counter, fired up the industrial grill, and started barking orders at her 2 waitresses with the precision of a general. Grant liked her immediately. The Rooks filled every booth, every stool, every inch of floor space that could reasonably hold a human being. The noise level rose fast. Voices, laughter, the clank of coffee mugs, the scrape of chairs, the jukebox cycling through something with a slow harmonica. Wet leather smelled like earth and road oil. Someone ordered the entire pie display. Cord, the Triumph man, took off his soaking jacket and wrung it out directly onto the floor without apology. Grant sat at the counter with his coffee. He was watching the room the way he always watched rooms. Not with paranoia, but with the quiet professional attention of someone who had learned that things go wrong in the places where everyone else is looking away. That was when he saw the girl. She came in through the service entrance, not the front door. That was the first thing. She was maybe 10 years old, possibly 11, small for her age, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big, The sleeves pulled down past her wrists even though she'd come in from outside in the rain and was already soaking. The jacket was adult-sized, a man's jacket. She had dark eyes that moved too fast, cataloging the room in a single sweep the way you learn to do when you grow up in a house where you need to know where the exits are. Behind her, gripping the hem of her jacket with both fists, was a boy. Younger. Maybe 6. He wore a t-shirt that was too thin for October and sneakers that had separated at the sole on the left foot. His hair was wet and plastered to his forehead. He was shaking, not just from cold. Grant watched them navigate the crowd. They were good at it. The girl moved with practiced efficiency, angling through the bodies of 200 bikers without touching anyone, without making eye contact, creating a path that kept maximum distance from every adult male in the room. The boy matched her exactly, mimicking her route, staying so close his face was essentially pressed against her back. Nobody noticed them. That was the second thing. 2 soaking children slipping through a packed roadside diner at 9:30 on a Wednesday night, and not one person turned to look. Not one person asked if they were all right. The world had a way of not seeing what it didn't want to deal with. Grant set down his coffee. He didn't move yet. He just watched. The girl was heading toward a booth in the back corner. A dead-end booth, he noted. One wall and one wall. No clean exit if something came at her from the front. She sat down with her back to the wall, pulled the boy in next to her, and then did something that hit Grant in the sternum like a slow punch. She looked at the menu for a long time, turned it over, looked at the back, and then put it down and folded her hands. She wasn't going to order. She couldn't afford to order. She'd sat down to get warm and stay invisible, and she already knew exactly how long she could do it before someone asked her to leave. Grant picked up his coffee, nodded once at Juno beside him. His second, a wiry man with a mechanical engineer's brain and a boxer's hands, and walked to the back corner booth. He stopped at the edge of the table. The girl looked up at him immediately, already prepared. He saw her calculate his size, his cut, the patch on his chest. He saw her decide in about 2 seconds whether he was a threat. Her hands went to the boy under the table, fingers finding his arm. Grant sat down across from them, without asking. He didn't lean forward. He didn't try to seem friendly. He just put his coffee down and said, "Cold night." The girl said nothing. The boy pressed tighter against her side. Grant looked at the menu. "The biscuits are good here," he said. "I've been through here before. Long time ago." He paused. "You eaten today?" Nothing for a moment. Then the girl's jaw shifted just slightly, and she said in a voice that barely carried over the diner noise, "We haven't eaten since yesterday." The table nearest them had 2 rooks mid-conversation. They went quiet. Then the table behind that one. The quiet moved outward like a ripple, spreading through the diner in that way that large gatherings have when something shifts the gravity of a room. By the time it reached the counter, June had already turned from her grill. The girl seemed to realize the room had changed. Her eyes went wide. She looked at Grant with the first real alarm she'd shown. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Nobody's going to make you go anywhere." He signaled June without turning around. 2 fingers. She already had the pad out. "Order what you want," Grant said. The girl looked at the menu. The boy hadn't moved. Grant watched her do the calculation. The same calculation he recognized from the faces of people who had been desperate long enough that receiving kindness felt more dangerous than being ignored. She was trying to figure out what this cost, what he wanted, what the price was going to be on the back end. "Just food," Grant said. "No strings." Her name, he found out eventually, was Ava. The boy was Noah, her brother. She gave up only the names and nothing else, and Grant didn't push. He watched them eat. Really eat. The way people eat when they haven't been sure of a next meal, fast and protective, Noah holding his plate close to his chest. And he drank his coffee and said nothing. It was the sleeves that wouldn't leave him alone. She kept pulling them down. Every time she reached for something, every time she lifted her fork, the sleeve rode up and she caught it and pulled it back. She did it automatically, without thinking, the way you do a thing you've practiced until it becomes reflex. Grant had seen that reflex before. He'd treated injuries on 2 continents. He knew what a person looked like when they were hiding something on their arms. He didn't look at the sleeves. He kept his eyes on her face. Moose appeared at the end of the booth. 6'4", 300 pounds, a beard that had been growing since a bet in 2019 that no one remembered the terms of anymore. He had a slice of pie in each hand, and the careful expression he used around anything small and frightened, which was the same expression he used around stray animals, which was a thing only the Rooks knew about him. Found the last of the cherry, he said to nobody in particular, and set a slice in front of Noah. Noah looked at it. Then he looked at Moose. Moose had already turned half away, making himself smaller, not pushing. Noah picked up the fork. Grant watched something behind Ava's eyes shift then. Not relief exactly, but a crack in the wall. Just a small one. The kind that happens when your guard has been up so long that a single unearned act of decency lands like a blow. Then the door to the diner opened, and the cold air came in with a man. Grant felt it before he saw it. The room shifted again. Different this time, not the gentle gravity change of two quiet children, but something harder, with edges. Boots on the old wood floor, confident and unhurried. Grant turned on his stool as the man moved through the crowd toward the back corner. He was tall, lean in the way that isn't healthy, the kind of lean that comes from discipline driven by something other than fitness. He wore a canvas work jacket, dark jeans, work boots. His face was pleasant enough, clean-shaven. He had the kind of eyes that smiled when his mouth did, but the smile never quite reached anything behind the eyes. The eyes stayed flat, and measuring the way a camera lens stays flat, recording without feeling. He stopped at the booth. "There you are," he said to Ava, and his voice was warm, parental, perfectly calibrated. "I've been looking everywhere for you two." Noah went rigid. It was the smallest possible movement, just a stiffening, a slight withdrawal, the body's honest response when the mind is still deciding what to say. But Grant caught it. He caught the way Ava's left hand found Noah's under the table and gripped, and the way her face reorganized itself into something neutral and careful. "This your father?" Grant asked Ava directly. She looked at the man. The man looked at Grant with that steady, pleasant expression. "Appreciate you keeping an eye on them," he said. "Kids wandered off in the storm." He reached for Ava's shoulder. She didn't flinch away. She was too well trained for that. But her eyes found Grant's in the half-second before the hand landed, and what Grant saw there was not a child caught somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. It was something older, something that had stopped expecting anyone to notice. Grant kept his voice easy. "Buy you a coffee?" "We're good." The hand on Ava's shoulder tightened almost imperceptibly. "Need to get these kids home." "Storm's still bad out there." "We'll be all right." He was already steering them out of the booth. Noah stumbled getting up, and the man's hand caught his arm. Too fast, too practiced, the grip of someone who knew exactly how hard to hold without leaving a mark in a public place. Grant stood up. He wasn't doing it aggressively. He wasn't blocking anyone. He simply rose to his full height, which was considerable, and the man looked at him, and for the first time the smile didn't immediately recalibrate. There was a pause, maybe half a second, where something genuine flickered behind the flat eyes. Not fear. Recalculation. Then the door opened again and Sheriff Kellen walked in. I was 50, broad, with a department-issue jacket, and the comfortable authority of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for the past 15 years. His deputy, Harlan, came in behind him. Younger, thinner, with the agreeable face of a man who had learned early that it was easier to go along. Kellen scanned the room, found the man with the children, and his expression settled into something welcoming. Old friends. Or something that looked like it. "Ray," he said, moving toward the back. "Heard you came in off the highway." Ray. The man's name was Ray. Kellen looked at Grant, at the Thunder Rooks filling every available surface of the diner. He didn't look worried, which was itself a signal. 200 bikers in a town this size would make most law enforcement nervous on principle. Kellen just looked like a man sizing up an inconvenience. "You boys just passing through?" he asked Grant. "Storm," Grant said. Kellen looked at the children. His expression didn't change when he looked at them. That was the thing. He looked at two small soaking children at 9:30 at night with a man. Grant's stomach had decided was all wrong, and his face stayed completely, professionally neutral. Not concerned. Not curious. Just neutral. Like he was looking at furniture. People learned that neutrality. It didn't come naturally. Grant's coffee had gone cold. He didn't look at it. Ava was moving with Ray toward the front of the diner now, Noah's hand in hers, both of them threading through the crowd of Rooks. Grant watched them go. He watched the way Noah's free hand stayed pressed against his own thigh, knuckle white, the way a small person holds themselves together when they can't hold anyone else. He watched Kellen and Harlan flank the group with the casual choreography of people who had done this particular routine before. He watched Ava's head turn back. One look, just one. Through 20 feet of crowded diner space, through the bodies of bikers and the noise and the rain hammering the windows, she found Grant's eyes, and she mouthed two words. He couldn't hear them, but he read them. Don't let. That was all. The crowd shifted, and she was gone through the door, and the cold air came in one more time, and then the door swung shut, and the diner was just a diner again, full of wet bikers and coffee, and the smell of road leather and frying eggs. And Sheriff Kellen was still standing at the back of the room watching Grant with that same administrative patience. "Good night to stay off the road," Kellen said. "Probably," Grant said. Kellen nodded once, like something had been established, and walked out. Harlan followed without looking at anyone. Grant stood at the back of the booth for a moment. Juno was beside him now, close enough to speak low. "You see the kids?" Juno said. "Yeah. The boy's arm, when the man grabbed him. I saw it." Juno was quiet for a second. "What do you want to do?" Grant looked at the door. Rain cracked against the glass like static. Then he noticed something on the seat where Ava had been sitting. It had been placed there deliberately, face down, slipped under the edge of the plate as she stood. He reached for it. A folded square of diner napkin. He opened it. 4 words, written in careful block letters, with what looked like a pen borrowed from behind the counter. The handwriting was precise, practiced, a child who'd been taught to be clear. Don't let him take us beneath it. Something else. Smaller. Like an afterthought that wasn't an afterthought at all. A number, 6 digits, and the word clinic. Grant looked at the door. Outside, headlights moved through the rain. 2 sets. Moving in the same direction. Moving fast. He closed the napkin in his fist and turned to Juno. "Get Moose. Get Cord. Get Deacon." He picked up his jacket from the stool. "We're going." Juno looked at him. "Grant, we don't know what She's 10 years old," Grant said. "She wrote that note before she sat down. She had it ready." He pulled on his jacket. "She's been trying to tell someone for a long time." He walked toward the door. The rooks near the entrance parted without being asked, reading something in his movement the way people who have ridden together long enough learn to read weather. June caught his eye from the counter. She wasn't asking questions, but her face said she'd seen the children too, and it said what it said. Grant pushed through the door into the rain. The headlights were already gone down the dark road. The storm had swallowed them. The cold hit him like a wall. October cold, the kind that smells like iron and wet leaves and the particular emptiness of highway country at night. His boots hit the gravel and the water came up over the soles, and he stood there for a second with the rain straight down on him, looking at the black road. Behind him, 3 Harleys fired. Then a 4th. Then Cord's Triumph, complaining loudly before it caught. Somewhere ahead in the dark, a little girl had written a note and hidden it under a plate in a roadside diner, and she had been precise enough to include a word that meant something specific, something that wasn't just a cry for help, but a location, a direction, a piece of intelligence. Clinic. Grant mounted up. The rain hammered the back of his neck. He pulled onto the road and the headlight cut a narrow path through the black. I didn't know yet what lived inside the word clinic, in a town where the sheriff smiled too easy and didn't worry about men with flat eyes and children who flinched. But in 6 digits and 1 word, Ava Hart had trusted a stranger with every chance she had left. He wasn't going to make her wrong about that. And what Grant Maddox would find at the end of that dark highway, behind locked doors, beneath storm-washed ground, would be the most devastating thing he'd ever uncovered. Not on a battlefield, not in a field hospital, right here in a county most people had never heard of, in a building that looked like it was trying to help. Part 2 drops next. Don't go anywhere. The road out of Garlow was a single lane of cracked asphalt that had been poorly repaved twice in the last decade, and showed it. The surface broken into uneven ridges that grabbed at tires in the rain, the shoulder nothing but gravel and dead grass dropping off into drainage ditches full of black water. Grant rode with his high beam cutting maybe 30 feet ahead and trusted the rest to instinct and the knowledge that whatever was in front of him mattered more than whatever was behind. Juno was on his left, Moose on his right, Cord and Deacon in a tight V behind them, 5 bikes, not 200. That had been the first argument, and it had happened in 40 seconds flat in the parking lot of June's diner while the rain came down and the rest of the rooks stood in the light of the doorway, watching with the careful attention of men who understood that their president was about to do something that had no club vote behind it. Deacon had said it directly, the way Deacon always did. You're riding into a county you don't know, following a car you lost in the dark, because of a note a kid wrote on a napkin. Yeah, Grant had said, that's not a plan. No. Grant. Deacon stepped closer, dropping his voice below the rain. He was 51 years old, the club's road captain, and had the weathered authority of a man who had been keeping other men alive through bad decisions for the better part of 3 decades. His face in the parking lot light was tight with something that wasn't fear. I followed you into worse, you know that, but you need to tell me what we're actually doing here. Grant had looked at the road, then back at Deacon. Cord said there's a county clinic about 4 miles out. She wrote the word clinic. She wrote a number. A 6-digit number could be anything. It's a door code, Juno said quietly from his right. She had a key card on her. I saw it when she stood up. It was in her jacket pocket, laminated. Everyone went quiet for a moment. Deacon had rubbed the back of his neck. If we go out there and it's nothing, then we come back wet, Grant said. He was already on his bike. I'm not asking the club. I'm asking you four. That was the thing about Grant Maddox that couldn't be taught and couldn't be argued with. He never issued orders that didn't include himself in the cost. Whatever he asked you to walk into, he was already standing inside it. Deacon had mounted up without another word. So had the others. But the argument wasn't over. It had just moved into the silence between the engines. Now the road curved through a stand of dead-leaf oaks, and Moose pulled up close enough to shout over the rain. You sure we didn't already lose them? No, Grant said, helpful. Stay on the road. The clinic appeared on the left about 4.5 miles out, a converted single-story building that might once have been a farm supply depot, then a physical therapy office, then something else. Layers of purpose visible in the architecture the way old paint shows through new paint on a badly prepped wall. The sign read ST. Alara Recovery and Wellness in the kind of clean institutional font designed to look trustworthy. Parking lot lights on timers. A chain-link fence along the east side. 3 vehicles in the lot, including a late-model pickup that matched nothing, Grant could confirm, but which his gut put at the scene. They pulled off the road 60 yards back and cut the engines. The silence was immediate and full, just rain and wind and the distant complaint of Cord's Triumph ticking as it cooled. 5 men sitting on dead bikes in the dark, looking at a building that looked completely ordinary, which was its own kind of signal. Lights on inside, Juno said, past midnight. Recovery clinic, Deacon said. Could be night staff. 6 staff vehicles, Moose said. Everyone counted the lot again. 6. At 12:15 in the morning, in a county with maybe 9,000 people, a wellness clinic had 6 vehicles in the lot. That wasn't a night nurse and a security guard. That was a full operational shift of people who were there for a reason. Grant dismounted. He left his helmet on the bike. The rain hit his face, and he let it. He was looking at the fence line, tracing it east toward the back of the property, and he was already doing the thing he'd learned to do in situations where you were operating without complete information. Building the picture from the edges in, mapping what you couldn't see from what you could. Juno, he said, can you get into their system if we find a hardwire point? Depends on the system. If it's the standard county infrastructure, yeah, I know that architecture. Juno paused. How are we getting inside? Grant looked at him. The key card she had. You don't have the key card. She left it in the booth, under the napkin. He pulled it from his jacket pocket. A white laminated rectangle with a magnetic stripe, a small barcode, and a handwritten number in the same precise block letters as the napkin, the 6-digit code. The silence stretched. She planned this, Cord said. I was the oldest of them. 58, Vietnam-era family, had been riding since before most of the others were born. His voice, when he used it, had a particular weight. That little girl planned for someone to find those. She left them on purpose. Nobody answered because the answer was obvious, and the obvious answer was the worst possible version of the situation. She had done this before, had tried to flag someone before, had the system ready, the code memorized, the card carried, the note pre-written in her head, waiting for a single moment when an adult might be paying attention. Which meant either this was the first time she'd found that moment, or it wasn't the first time, and the other times hadn't worked. Grant moved toward the fence. They went over it single file, Moose last and slow, his size making it a more deliberate operation. The east side of the building was dark, no windows. The wall blank institutional concrete with a single metal door recessed into a frame. Grant swiped the card. A red light. He entered the 6 digits on the keypad beside it. The light went green. The door opened on a corridor lit by fluorescent strips, the kind of flat institutional light that makes everyone look slightly sick. The floor was tile. It smelled like disinfectant and something underneath the disinfectant, something that no amount of chemical could completely eliminate, which was the smell of people living in confined spaces for extended periods. Grant recognized it. He'd smelled it in detention facilities. He'd smelled it in military holding. He'd smelled it in places that were called one thing on official documents and were something else entirely in practice. His stomach went very still. They moved single file down the corridor, Grant first, Deacon on rear. The building was longer than its exterior suggested, the footprint extending backward from the road-facing face, which itself explained the parking lot, which was tucked behind a visual break in the fence, designed not to be looked at. The first room was empty. Metal shelving, folded materials that might have been laundry, a clipboard on the wall with columns of names and numbers, intake records, or something formatted like intake records. The first column dates going back 14 months. Juno photographed it without being asked. The second room had a lock that the keycard didn't open. Grant pressed his ear to the door and heard nothing, which meant either nothing was inside or something inside had learned to be completely silent. He had his hand flat on the door when Cord touched his shoulder and pointed back the way they'd come. Voices. Getting closer. 2 people, the cadence of ordinary institutional conversation. Shift handoff talk, the specific low-energy exchange of people doing a late-night job they'd done many times before. Grant counted the distance and moved the group into the empty room, door closed to a crack, and waited. 2 figures passed in the corridor, both in civilian clothes, not uniforms, but with the lanyard and badge presence of official employment. A man and a woman. The woman was carrying a thermos. The man was carrying a tablet, tapping through something with the distracted efficiency of data entry. "Move the 3 from the east wing before the storm got bad," the man said. "Where?" "Kellen's call. I don't ask." "The family group?" "Still here. I want documentation finalized before—" They turned the corner and the voices dropped below range. Nobody moved for a count of 15. Then Juno leaned close to Grant's ear. "Did you hear? East wing. There's an east wing." "I heard." "And family group." Grant's jaw set. They found the east wing by following the corridor to its junction and taking the branch that led toward the back of the property. The fluorescent light got worse here, one strip flickering, another out entirely. The doors changed character. The ones they'd passed had been institutional but ordinary. These doors had additional hardware, a second lock beneath the card reader, no window panels. The kind of sealed frame that was less about privacy and more about containment. Moose put his hand on the wall beside one of the doors and looked at Grant. Grant swiped the card. Nothing. Tried the code. Nothing. Different clearance. The card was getting them through service areas, access points, corridors, not these rooms. Whoever Ava was in this facility's hierarchy, she had enough access to move through the building, but not enough to open these specific doors, which meant she'd been inside them, brought inside, not accessing them independently. Grant felt the specific cold that had nothing to do with temperature or rain. "We need the system," he said to Juno. Juno was already scanning the corridor. "There'll be a server room, network closet, something. Standard county infrastructure runs fiber to a central hub. If I can get into the hub—" He moved ahead, checking door frames, looking for the right profile of room. "Here," he said, 20 feet down, at a door that opened on the keycard without code. Inside, a rack of equipment, blinking green lights, a workstation running idle. "How long?" Grant said. 10 minutes, maybe 15. "Make it 8. Juno sat down at the workstation. His hands were immediately efficient, no wasted movement. He'd been an IT systems engineer before he was a rook. Then he'd been both simultaneously for a while, and now he was sitting in an illegal network access situation in a facility. He'd entered on a child's keycard, and he was calm about it, the way competent people are calm about things they actually know how to do. Deacon had positioned himself at the corridor junction, visible from both directions, acting as a standing alarm system. Cord was at the door they'd entered through. Moose was with Grant, which was where Moose was always positioned. Not ordered there, just gravitationally present, the way large objects accumulate mass. Grant. Moose kept his voice below conversation level. They were standing close enough that it carried. Back at the diner, the sheriff. What about him? He knew the man, the one with the kids, called him by name. Ray. Like they'd met before. Not like a cop meeting someone on a call. Like they knew each other. Grant nodded. So if we find what I think we're going to find in here, Moose said, we can't call the county sheriff. No. State police? Grant thought about it. Maybe. Depends on how deep this goes. He looked at the closed doors in the corridor. Depends on what's in those rooms. The words hung there between them. Two large men standing in a dim corridor that smelled like containment, knowing that whatever was in those sealed rooms had been put there by people with official sanction and official protection, and knowing that the usual channels for addressing that kind of thing ran directly through those same people. Juno, Grant said, louder by 1 degree. 4 more minutes. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, Juno turned from the screen with the expression of a man who has found exactly what he was afraid of finding. He didn't speak immediately. He turned back to the screen and exported something to the small drive he'd plugged into the workstation's USB, and then he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the edge of the console. Juno, Grant said. It's a processing facility, Juno said. He didn't turn around. The rooms in this wing, they're holding rooms. He pulled the drive. 14 names on the current intake log, adults and minors. The adults are listed as voluntary residential. The minors are listed under the adults as, he stopped, reformulated, as dependents, like they're property of the adult they're assigned to. The fluorescent light flickered above them. What else? Grant said. Not a question. Transfer log, recent. 3 weeks of transfer records going to addresses. I don't know these addresses. They're coded, but there's a vehicle manifest attached, and the vehicles are all... He turned around now. His eyes in the bad light were something specific, something that happened to a man's eyes. When he processes something, his brain keeps trying to reject. Private transport, non-commercial. And there's a financial ledger, Grant. It's not small numbers. Nobody said anything. How many children? Grant said. Juno looked at the drive in his hand. In the current log, 6. Including 2 listed under the name R. Calder. R. Calder, Ray. Moose's face went through several things in rapid succession and ended somewhere that was the particular stillness of a man with a significant capacity for violence, applying everything he had to, not using it right now in this room. The East Wing rooms, Grant said. 6 children. Are they in there now? The log shows them checked in 4 days ago. No discharge record. 4 days. Ava had been carrying that card for 4 days. Had been waiting, in a building with locked doors and no windows, for a single moment when she could slip it to someone who might actually use it. Grant moved out of the server room. What are you doing? Deacon said from the junction. Opening those doors. Grant, we cannot... If we open those rooms, we are committing a felony, on top of a trespass, on top of... There are children inside those rooms, Deacon. I know that. Deacon stepped into his path, not blocking, standing close enough to make the conversation physical, the way men who trust each other talk when the stakes require it. I know that, but if we open those rooms and take those kids, we are kidnapping, legally. It doesn't matter what we know about what's in that log. We are not law enforcement. We don't have a warrant, and in a county where the sheriff is apparently part of this, we will be the ones who get arrested. And if we get arrested, those kids go right back to wherever they were going. Grant stopped. He stood in the corridor with the keycard in his hand and the row of sealed doors 10 feet away, and Deacon's eyes on him, and he worked through it. It was the kind of calculation that takes approximately 2 seconds for a man with good tactical sense and feels like swallowing glass the entire time. Then we document, Grant said. Everything. Every room we can access, every record. We get it out, and then we... He stopped. From behind one of the sealed doors, a sound. Very small. The kind of sound that a person makes who has learned to be silent, but can't quite hold it when they hear voices in the corridor that don't match the voices they've been hearing for 4 days. It was a child's sound. Moose made a noise that wasn't a word. And then from the far end of the corridor, from the direction of the junction they'd come through, Deacon said a single syllable in a voice that had all the warmth removed from it. Grant. Grant turned. Sheriff Kellen was standing at the end of the corridor with his hand on the wall-mounted light switch, and he was not surprised to see them there, which was the worst possible version of this moment. Because a man who is not surprised is a man who already knew you were coming, which meant the diner had been the trap, and they had walked into it carrying a dead child's key card and a flash drive of evidence that proved they had accessed a county medical facility without authorization. Kellen reached up and turned the corridor lights off. In the total darkness, Grant heard two things: the metallic click of a firearm being cleared to fire, and from behind one of the sealed doors, the sound of a small person pressing themselves against the wall and going completely, expertly silent. He had heard that sound before, but never from someone so... The darkness in that corridor was total, not the manageable dark of a room with curtains drawn or a road without streetlights. The absolute dark of a space designed to contain, where the removal of light was itself a form of control. Grant stood with his back against the wall and counted his own heartbeat the way he'd been trained to do in situations where the body wanted to run the math on survival and the mind needed to stay in front of it. 4 seconds since the lights went out. Kellen was at the far end of the corridor, approximately 20 feet. The sound of his breathing was controlled. A man who had done this before, who knew how to stand in a dark space with a drawn weapon and wait for the other person to make the mistake of moving first. The click Grant had heard was a round being chambered, which meant the weapon hadn't been ready when Kellen came in, which meant some part of this had been faster than expected, which was the first piece of usable information. The second piece was the door. Behind one of the sealed doors, the third on the right, he'd been counting, a child had pressed against a wall and gone silent. Was still silent, which meant the child had done this before too, had been in this specific darkness with this specific quality of waiting and had learned the survival protocol that a small person learns in a controlled space. Be smaller. Be nothing. Do not give them a sound to aim at. Grant breathed. He had Juno on his left, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, which meant Juno was also breathing, also counting, also running his own calculations. Juno's calculations would be different from Grant's. Juno was an engineer by training, thought in systems and structural logic, would be mapping the corridor's geometry in his memory and identifying the variables. How many steps to each door? Where the wall junctions were. Whether the emergency exit requirement for this type of building meant a secondary light source somewhere. There, at the far end, just visible as Grant's eyes adjusted, the faintest green edge of an exit indicator light over a door that was not the door they'd come in through. A second exit, running south. Grant put 2 fingers against Juno's arm. The pressure said, south door. Juno's hand found his wrist and pressed once, acknowledged. The problem was the 20 feet between them and Kellen. A corridor is a fatal funnel. Any law enforcement or military person understood that instinctively it was the first thing you learned about indoor spaces. The geometry was inescapable. Moving toward the exit meant moving toward Kellen, and Kellen had a drawn weapon and a flat patience that Grant did not want to test in the dark against an adversary with positional advantage. Unless... Grant reached down to his boot. The multi-tool was there. He carried it in the same habit as everything else. Things that were needed eventually were needed suddenly. The logic was unassailable. He found the flashlight function on it, small, directional, the kind that throws a beam about 6 feet. He angled it toward the floor, toward the far end of the corridor, away from Juno, away from the south door. Then he turned it on for 1 second. The beam hit the floor and threw a wedge of light that illuminated exactly enough of Kellen's position to confirm him, right side of the corridor, weapon up, 10 inches from the wall. And Kellen's instinct was the instinct of every trained officer in a sudden light situation, which was to acquire the light source as a target priority, and in the half second while that reorientation was happening, Grant and Juno moved, not toward Kellen. South. Fast and low, Grant's shoulder hitting the door bar of the emergency exit, the bar giving under pressure, the door swinging open into the cold outside air and the thin rain in the compound's back lot, and then both of them were through and the door swung shut behind them and Grant was already running. They covered 40 yards before stopping behind a concrete equipment block, both men breathing hard. The cold hit immediately. The building had been warm with the residual heat of people and machinery, and outside was October at 5 in the morning, which was a specific unkind temperature. "Moose," Juno said, catching his breath. "Still inside." "Deacon and the others?" Grant looked toward the front of the compound. No sound of engines. The bikes were where they'd left them, 60 yards back from the fence, which meant Cord and Deacon were still at the entry point, which meant the situation had moved faster than the extraction plan had assumed. His phone had one bar. He tried Cord. It rang twice and connected. "Where are you, Tars?" Cord said. "Behind the building. South lot. Kellen's inside. We got separated from Moose." Grant kept his voice flat and functional. "There are children in sealed rooms in the east corridor. Cord. They're in there right now." The silence on the line was very short. "What do you need?" Cord said. "Keep the front clear. Don't let anyone leave that compound in a vehicle. Deacon needs to get on the phone to not county, not state county, go federal, go tip line, go media, go everything simultaneously, everything Juno transmitted plus live location. Now. Grant, Kellen has backup coming. I don't know the timeline, but he had a plan for us being here, and the plan wasn't to handle it alone. Get it out, Cord. All of it. The only thing that protects those kids now is too many eyes." He ended the call. Juno was looking at him in the thin dark. "Moose," he said again. Grant looked at the building. One window on the south wall, opaque, lit faintly from inside by the emergency yellow. The battery backup had kicked in somewhere, restoring partial light. He could see the building's perimeter, the door they'd come out of, the equipment block they were behind, the fence line 40 feet east. "Kellen didn't shoot," Grant said. Juno looked at him. "In the corridor, he had position, he had advantage. We were in a fatal funnel, and he had a drawn weapon. He didn't fire." Grant watched the south door. "He wants us alive and in custody, which means he needs us controllable, which means there's something about the situation where dead bikers are a worse outcome for him than arrested bikers." "That's a reason not to shoot us in the dark," Juno said. "That's not a reason to feel safe." "No," Grant agreed. "But it's a reason he'll put Moose in a cell before he does anything else. He needs the leverage." "So Moose is in a cell." "Moose is in a cell." Juno processed this. "And the children in the east corridor." Grant's jaw set. "Kellen's not going to touch them. Not tonight. Not while there are 200 rooks within 5 miles. The whole operation depends on it not being visible. If something happens to those kids tonight, it becomes the headline that can't be managed. He knows that. So he's going to move them." The word landed between them in the cold air. Move them. The language from the corridor. The conversation between the 2 facility workers that Grant had heard through the server room wall. Before morning, the language from the intake logs, transfer records, vehicle manifests, non-commercial transport. "When?" Juno said. "Before the transmission gets traction, before anyone acts on what we sent." Grant looked at his watch. 5:12 in the morning. "We have maybe 3 hours before the first state office opens, maybe 2 before an overnight duty officer picks up the tip line. That's his window." "Then that's our window," Juno said. They went back in through a different entry. A utility door on the east perimeter that the keycard opened without a code, which meant it was below the security threshold of the interior rooms, but above the perimeter fence access, a middle layer in the system's clearance architecture. Inside was a mechanical space, water heaters, electrical panels, HVAC equipment, making the low continuous sound of a building breathing. The space connected to the main corridor by a service door that was propped open with a folded piece of cardboard, the kind of thoughtless prop that accumulates in institutional spaces where staff move back and forth constantly and find door-holding wedges wherever they're available. Grant listened at the service door for 30 seconds before pushing through. The corridor was empty. The emergency lights gave it the yellow underwater quality of a space that had been modified from its intended purpose. The east wing was ahead. The sealed doors were still sealed, and from somewhere in the front section of the building, the administrative area, the entry, the sound of voices. Not conversation, something more structured. An exchange with the particular cadence of instruction being given and received. Grant moved toward it. The administrative office was separated from the corridor by a window panel, the kind used in institutional spaces to allow visual oversight, the glass running from chest height to ceiling. Grant came up to the wall beside it, and looked through the angle of the frame. Kellen was there, and a man Grant hadn't seen before. This man was not County. He was wearing dark civilian clothes with a precision that suggested they'd been selected carefully, no logos, no identifying detail. He was approximately 50, with the kind of posture that came from a specific training background. Not law enforcement posture, something more particular. The posture of a person who had spent time in environments where physical self-presentation was a professional tool. He was looking at a tablet, scrolling through something, and talking to Kellen in a low voice that didn't carry through the glass. But his hands did. Grant looked at the man's hands on the tablet, and something in the back of his mind pulled at a thread he couldn't immediately locate. The man turned slightly, and Grant caught his profile. The jaw, the specific angle, and the thread connected. He'd seen that profile before, not in person, in a photograph. A photograph that was attached to a case file that had crossed his path 2 years ago through a contact in another state. A situation that had a different geography and different names, but a structural similarity that Grant had noted at the time and filed away because that was the way he processed information that didn't yet have a place to live. The file had been about a network, an operation that moved through legitimate institutional structures, clinics, care facilities, county administration, in rural counties where oversight was thin and local law enforcement was either insufficient or acquired. The network had a name in the file, the kind of operational name that investigators used internally. He couldn't pull the name, but the profile through the glass was in that file, which meant this was not a county operation, which meant Kellen was not the top of this, which meant everything Grant had been calculating, the exposure, the documentation, the 200 Rooks pressure, the state tip lines, had been calculated against the wrong adversary. Kellen was a node, a protected node, well-established, operationally effective, but a node in a system that extended well beyond Garlow County and well beyond any jurisdiction that a state investigator's morning inbox was going to be able to address quickly. Grant breathed. Juno was beside him. Grant tapped his own eye. "Look," and angled his head toward the window panel. Juno looked for 3 seconds and came back with his eyes doing the thing they did when his engineering brain had made a connection that it didn't like. They moved back to the mechanical room. "You know him," Juno said. "Not a question. Not personally. I've seen his profile in a case context, 2 years ago." Grant kept his voice at the floor, just above the sound of the HVAC. "The network is bigger than this county, Juno. Kellen's a piece of it, not the architect." Juno sat with that for a moment. "How much bigger?" "I don't know, but the man in there didn't drive to Garlow County in the middle of the night because a county sheriff called him panicking. He's here because this is a managed node in something that has protocol for exactly this kind of situation." "Protocol meaning?" "Meaning they have a plan for when a node gets exposed, a containment plan." Grant looked at the service door. "That's what he's here to execute." "Containment, meaning the evidence." "And the witnesses," Grant said. The word hung in the mechanical room between them. Witnesses. The people in the sealed rooms, the women, the children, the intake logs, the transfer records. A containment protocol for a sophisticated operation didn't leave witnesses who could speak to investigators about the scope of what they'd seen and experienced. It moved them, or it did something else. "Cord needs to know this," Juno said. "Cord needs to get everyone in position first." Grant pulled his phone. Still 1 bar. "If we pull the Rooks in and this man in there triggers his own escalation protocol, what kind of escalation protocol does someone like that have?" Grant looked at him. "The kind that has already thought through exactly what happens when 200 bikers show up at a compound in a rural county." Juno's face went through something that was not fear. Juno had the specific quality of someone who had processed fear into a different emotion at some point in his history and now expressed what others would call fear as a kind of sharp, cold clarity. They have an exit. Has to be. You don't run an operation through institutional infrastructure in isolated counties without a planned exit for the hardware. The files, the records, the people. Grant thought about the tunnel under the clinic, the corridor system connecting the buildings, the facility architecture designed for internal movement without external visibility. The tunnel doesn't just connect the clinic to the station, it goes somewhere else. How do you know? Because it's not finished. What we found was a segment, The keycard accessed service areas and a server room, the middle of the system, not the end. He looked at the ceiling, at the building's orientation, running the geography in his mind. East. The compound is northeast of the clinic. The tunnel would run east-northeast from the clinic's basement. It would come up somewhere on this property. Juno was very still. The barn, he said. The barn was at the back of the compound, furthest from the road, set against the property's east fence line. They'd seen it from the road, a low structure with metal siding, newer than it looked, the kind of agricultural building that served no agricultural purpose. The barn, Grant said. Getting to the barn meant crossing the compound's open central space, which was currently lit by the compound's exterior security lights. Battery-backed, apparently, still operational despite the power interruption, and potentially observable from the administrative office window if anyone in that office was looking in the right direction at the right moment. They didn't have a better option. Grant went first, moving along the building's south wall to its corner, then across the compound in the direct line that minimized exposure time. The cold air on his face and the security lights throwing flat shadows across the wet gravel and the sound of his boots. Controlled, heel first, the motion of moving quickly without sounding like it. Juno followed 8 seconds behind, the interval enough that they weren't a group, weren't a single target, were 2 separate problems for any observer to process. The barn door was padlocked with a heavy commercial lock that the keycard didn't touch. Grant looked at it for 2 seconds, then at the door frame, then at the hinges. The hinges were exterior, old installation, or a deliberate choice, the kind of choice that prioritized quick internal access over security, which told him something about who used this door and from which side. He had the hinge pins out in 90 seconds. The door swung from the wrong side and they were in. The smell hit first. The same smell as the corridor layered under motor oil and old timber. The containment smell, the confined people smell. But older here, more embedded, the smell of something that had been happening in this space for longer than the east wing of the clinic. The barn's interior had been divided, rough partitions of plywood and metal sheeting creating a series of spaces that bore no relationship to any agricultural use. Lighting by utility strings, currently off. Metal shelving along 2 walls holding what appeared to be file boxes, labeled in the same administrative shorthand as the intake logs. And in the floor, centered in the back section of the barn, a hatch. Steel-framed, recessed, with a heavy pull handle and a combination lock that had been left. And this was the detail that stopped Grant's breathing for a full second, hanging open. Not locked, left unsecured. Because someone had come through it recently, from the other direction, and had not yet secured it behind them. The man in the administrative office. He hadn't driven to the compound. He'd come through the tunnel. Juno was already beside him, looking at the open lock with the same expression Grant was feeling. The expression of a puzzle, resolving into a shape that was worse than the shapes you'd considered before you had all the pieces. "He's already here," Juno said. "He was already here before we were. He came in through the tunnel before we arrived at the compound." "Before Kellen even knew we were at the clinic," Grant said. Which means Kellen didn't call him. He was already in position. Grant looked at the hatch, at the open lock, at the file boxes on the shelves. "This isn't a response to us. We walked into an operation that was already in motion." "They were already moving," Juno said. "Tonight, before the storm, before the diner. They were already in the process of closing this location," Grant said. "Moving everything, the people, the records." He looked at the file boxes. "Us showing up tonight didn't create a crisis. We walked into the middle of one that was already happening." "That's why Kellen didn't shoot," Juno said, "because shooting us creates a different kind of crisis. He needs this to close clean, and 2 dead bikers is not clean." "Nothing about tonight is clean anymore," Grant said. He lifted the hatch. The tunnel below was lit. A strip of battery lights along the left wall, the same emergency yellow as the corridor, running away into the earth in a direction that confirmed what Grant had calculated, east-northeast, toward the clinic. And from below, faint but unmistakable, the sound of movement, feet on a concrete floor. More than 2 people. The specific sound of people moving with the focused urgency of a relocation in progress. They were moving the children through the tunnel. Right now. While Grant and Juno stood in the barn above with the hatch open in their hands, Grant's phone buzzed. He answered without looking. Deacon's voice, stripped to its operational register, every syllable carrying its full weight. "Grant, the station, they just took Moose." "I know. Not to county lockup." Deacon's voice had something in it that Grant had heard maybe twice in the 20 years they'd ridden together. The sound of a man who has encountered a fact that his experience hasn't prepared him for. "Grant, they took him to the clinic. The deputies took Moose to the clinic." Grant stood over the open hatch. Below, the sound of feet on concrete continued. The steady, organized movement of a transport already in progress, moving through the earth under the compound, carrying children through a tunnel toward a destination that Grant had not yet identified, and now also carrying the information that Moose was inside the same system. Not in a county cell where legal mechanisms could find him, but in the building that connected to the barn, that connected to the tunnel, that Grant was standing over with the hatch open in his hand and the cold air of October rising up from the ground like the exhale of something that had been waiting a long time to be. The sheriff's station had 12 windows facing the street. Grant had counted them twice from the tree line across the road, crouched in wet grass with Juno beside him and the rain starting again. Lighter now, more of a mist that coated everything in a cold film and made the parking lot lights bleed into halos. 3 patrol vehicles out front. 1 unmarked sedan that hadn't been there that morning. Lights on in the back 2 offices and the holding area. Kellen's personal truck parked at an angle near the side door like he'd arrived fast and hadn't bothered to straighten it. Inside that building, Moose. Arrested on a manufactured obstruction charge 4 hours ago, taken in flex cuffs while Grant and the others scattered into the tree line behind the clinic. Inside that building also, according to what Juno had pulled from the network before the lights went out, a secondary holding room that the official county records listed as a storage annex. It was not a storage annex. The Thunder Rooks had been regrouping since 3 in the morning. Full club now. All 212 pulled in from the highway, from the 2 motels out on Route 9, from the parking lot of June's diner, where June herself had apparently been feeding them coffee and not asking questions with the efficiency of a woman who understood that some nights required that specific kind of help. They were staged in 4 positions along the 2 roads leading into the county seat, engines cold, phones out, waiting. Grant stood at the hood of Deacon's truck with a road map and 3 men who had between them approximately 90 years of experience doing difficult things in bad conditions. "We have maybe 2 hours before Kellen moves Moose to county lockup," Deacon said. His voice was the flat operational register he used when emotions were present, but work was more urgent. Once he's in the county system, it gets complicated. "He's not going to county lockup," Grant said. "Then what's the play?" Grant looked at the map. The station sat at the center of a 4-block grid that constituted most of what Garlow County called a town. 1 main road in, 1 road out to the east, a service road behind the municipal buildings that connected the station to the county offices, and 3 blocks further to the building that publicly identified itself as the records annex, but which Juno's Access had flagged as sharing a utility corridor with the clinic's secondary site. The same corridor system, extended further than any of them had understood when they were standing inside it. "The tunnel," Juno said. He was looking at the map coordinates he'd pulled from the clinic's infrastructure documents. "The service corridor from the clinic runs under the road. It connects to the records annex, which means it connects to the station," Grant said, "or close enough." Cord made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "They built the whole system connected," Deacon said slowly. "The clinic, the annex, the station. You could move people from one end to the other without ever putting them in a vehicle." "Without ever putting them where anyone could see them," Grant said. The map lay there between them, and nobody spoke for a moment because what the map now represented had shifted from a county infrastructure layout into something that had a different name. A name that required the kind of response that went beyond 4 men in a parking lot and whatever they could improvise before dawn. "We need documentation out before we move," Grant said. "All of it. Everything Juno pulled, the photos from the clinic, the intake logs. It goes to state law enforcement, federal tip lines, and every media contact we have simultaneously before we touch that building. If Kellen sees evidence requests coming in, he's going to see us coming regardless. The question is whether the evidence survives it." Grant looked at Juno. "How long to transmit everything?" "It's already packaged, 20 minutes to upload to the secure drop. Another 10 to send the contact list. Juno paused. I need a clean signal. The county network will flag it. Use the diner's Wi-Fi, Grant said. June's. Cord raised an eyebrow. You're going to ask that woman to... I'm going to ask if she's willing. Different thing. Grant folded the map. If she says no, we find another way. But she's been watching children come through that county for however long this has been running, and she hasn't said a word to us that wasn't exactly what we needed. He was in the truck and moving before anyone responded. June's diner at 4:15 in the morning was quiet in the specific way of a place that had deliberately stayed open when it had every reason to close. 2 rooks sat at the counter with coffee going cold in front of them, less eating and more existing as a presence. The way the club had collectively understood without a conversation that June's needed to not be an empty building tonight. June herself was behind the counter, wiping the same section of Formica she'd wiped 4 times already. The motion of a person keeping their hands occupied while their mind worked on something else. She looked at Grant when he came through the door and set down the cloth. I need your Wi-Fi, Grant said. Clean signal, 10 minutes, something specific transmitted out. June looked at him for exactly 1 second. Passwords written on the back of the register receipt holder. She picked up the cloth again. Coffee? Please. He sat at the counter and Juno sat up at the table nearest the router, and Grant drank bad coffee and watched the door and tried not to think about Moose in a holding room in a building run by a sheriff who had turned off the lights in a corridor with a firearm already drawn and had then, and this was the part that kept reconstructing itself in Grant's mind, had then not fired, had turned the lights off and not fired, which meant he wanted them arrested, not dead, which meant he needed them controllable, not eliminated, which meant there was something about the situation that made live Thunder Rooks more useful to Kellen than dead ones, and Grant had been turning that over for 4 hours without arriving at a clean answer, and the absence of a clean answer was its own kind of alarm. Juno looked up from the laptop. Transmitting. The diner was quiet enough that the rain on the roof was audible, a soft, irregular percussion like thinking. Grant's phone buzzed, unknown number, which in the current situation meant one of the rooks using a burner. He answered. East Road, said the voice. Deacon. Vehicle, coming in slow. What kind? Black SUV, no plates I can read. Slowed at the Route 9 junction, now it's heading toward the station. How many inside? Can't tell, tinted. Stay on it, don't engage. He hung up. Juno was watching him. How much longer? Grant said. 6 minutes. 5.5 minutes later, Juno closed the laptop and said done in the same tone a surgeon uses when a procedure has gone exactly as intended and the next part of the problem belongs to someone else's hands. Grant left cash on the counter for the coffee, looked at June, and June looked back at him with the particular expression of a woman who had decided something privately that she wasn't going to explain. The children, she said. Not a question. Working on it, Grant said. Work faster, June said. She picked up the cloth. The plan had 4 moving parts and 0 tolerance for timing failures. Juno and 2 rooks named Petra and Walsh, both former military, both with the specific skill set that the situation required, which was the ability to move through a space quickly without creating noise, would enter the service corridor from an access point Juno had identified in the clinic's basement. Their objective was the records annex and whatever was being held there. Document, witness, establish presence. Do not engage unless engaged. Deacon would position 60 rooks on the 2 main approaches to the station in plain sight. Not blocking, not threatening, standing with phones out. 60 people recording a public building from public property was not an arrestable situation, and Kellen knew that, and knowing that Kellen knew, it was the point. Visible pressure, the kind that made officials who were about to do something irreversible pause long enough to reconsider. Cord would take the remaining rooks to the clinic site. The primary objective there was the East Wing, the sealed rooms. Cord had the copied keycard data that Juno had cloned to a second strip. He had instructions that Grant had delivered in exactly 12 words. Get those doors open, document everything, do not move anyone until I say. Grant himself was going into the station. Moose was in there. That was the immediate reason. But the more complete reason, the one Grant hadn't fully articulated even to Deacon, was that Kellen had made a specific choice in that corridor, had chosen arrest over elimination, and Grant needed to understand why before the situation reached its conclusion. Because a man who had built a network this sophisticated and protected it this effectively for this long did not make arbitrary tactical decisions. And the decision not to shoot had a reason, and the reason was information. He went in through the front door. It was not a subtle entry. He was one man walking into a law enforcement building at 4:30 in the morning after having been in that same sheriff's facility without authorization 6 hours earlier, and every person inside knew exactly who he was. He walked to the front desk where a Deputy Grant didn't recognize, looked up with the expression of a man who had been briefed and was trying to determine whether the briefing had prepared him adequately for the actual experience of Grant Maddox walking through his door. "I'm here about my man," Grant said. "Moose Callahan. Arrested earlier tonight." The deputy picked up a phone. "Put it down," Grant said. The deputy put it down. This was not because Grant had issued a threat. It was because Grant's voice in that moment had the quality of a statement that had already taken the next 20 seconds of events into account and had determined that picking up the phone was not going to produce the outcome the deputy was hoping for. The deputy understood this on some level below language. "Get Kellen," Grant said. "Tell him Grant Maddox is at the front desk and would like to discuss an arrangement." The word arrangement landed in the room and changed the air pressure slightly. 2 minutes later, Kellen came through the interior door. He was in civilian clothes, a dark shirt, work pants, the absence of uniform, a statement that this conversation was happening in a category that didn't have official paperwork. He stopped at the door frame and looked at Grant. "You've got nerve," Kellen said. "I've got documentation," Grant said. "Transmitted 20 minutes ago to the state AG's office, 3 federal tip systems, and 7 journalists in 2 states. He kept his hands visible and his voice even. "I'm not here to fight you." Kellen studied him. The flat patience was still there, but behind it, for the first time, something had shifted slightly. The quality of a man doing a rapid structural recalculation. "Then what are you here for?" "To give you a decision." Kellen moved to this counter. Not the interview rooms, not the back, staying in the entry space where the deputy was still present, and the front windows let in the parking lot light. He crossed his arms. "Talk. Let Moose go. Stand your people down at the annex and the clinic. Let the families in those rooms leave with their children." Grant watched Kellen's face. "Or don't. And spend the next 6 months explaining to federal investigators why a county sheriff was running transport infrastructure through a medical facility for people who weren't patients." "You don't know what you found," Kellen said. His voice was steady. "You know what a partial record looks like, pulled by someone who accessed a protected system illegally. Whatever you sent out is going to get looked at in the context of a breaking and entering and an obstruction arrest. Your credibility in this county is—" "I don't need credibility in this county," Grant said. "I need credibility for the next 40 minutes, and I have 60 people standing outside this building right now with phones recording, and I have a state-level transmission that's already sitting in an inbox somewhere waiting for a morning shift to open it. You can arrest me. You can arrest all of us, but you cannot arrest the transmission." Kellen uncrossed his arms. It was a small movement, but it was the movement of a man whose architecture had just sustained damage in a location he hadn't fully reinforced. Grant's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't look at it. It buzzed again. He held Kellen's eyes. A third time. Then Cord's voice, because Grant had answered by instinct without breaking the stare. "Grant?" "The clinic. The East Wing." "What?" "The rooms are empty." Cord's voice had something in it that Grant hadn't heard from him in years, a specific stripped-down quality, like paint removed down to bare metal. "The rooms are empty, and there's a tunnel access we didn't see before. A second tunnel. Goes east. Under the property line." Grant felt the cold again, the temperature-independent cold. "Where does it go?" Grant said. "We're following it." Grant looked at Kellen. Kellen was looking back at him, and his face had reorganized itself into something that was no longer quite the administrative patience it had been projecting. What was underneath was harder to name. Not guilt. Men like Kellen had processed guilt out of operational consciousness years ago. Something more functional. The expression of a man whose contingency had just activated. "Where are the children?" Grant said. Kellen said nothing. Kellen. Grant stepped forward, one step, deliberate, controlled. The deputy at the desk made a small movement toward his belt and stopped when he looked at Grant's face. Where are those children right now? You should be careful, Kellen said quietly, about what you open. I'm past careful. You don't understand the scope of what... I understand 6 children. I understand a 6-year-old boy who shakes when a man moves too fast. Grant's voice had gone to a register that was below anger, below the architecture of controlled emotion, down to something foundational and absolute. I understand a 10-year-old girl who memorized a door code and carried a key card for 4 days waiting for someone to notice. Where are they? Kellen looked at him for a long moment. Then something moved across his face. Not remorse, not conscience, but the specific cold assessment of a man who had just determined that one position was no longer viable and was pivoting to the next. You want the kids? Kellen said. Drive 4 miles east on the county road, past the grain elevator. There's a farm. Grant held still. There's a farm, Kellen said again, and you cannot go there as a civilian. I'm telling you that clearly. The people operating that facility are not county employees, and they are not under my control. And if you ride 200 motorcycles onto that property, what happens to those children will be your... Grant was already moving. He was through the door before Kellen finished the sentence and into the parking lot where the mist had thickened back toward rain, and 60 Rooks stood in the arc of the parking lot lights, with phones raised, and the whole scene was lit the way crime scenes are lit, flat, bright, the ordinary world made suddenly terrible by what it was illuminating. Deacon was at his side in 4 steps. What? Farm. 4 miles east. That's where they moved them. Grant was at his bike. Get everyone moving. Everyone. Now. Grant, we don't have time, Grant said. The engine fired. We don't have a warrant, and we don't have authority, and we don't have anything except the fact that those kids are on that property, and somebody made a decision to move them tonight, which means they are running, Deacon. They are running right now. Deacon looked at him for 1 second, then he pulled out his phone. The sound of 200 Harley engines starting in sequence in a county parking lot at 4:40 in the morning was not a subtle sound. It was the sound of a decision made collectively and irrevocably. The sound of men who had each made their individual calculation and arrived at the same place, which was the place past the point where you weigh the consequences and into the territory where the only weight that matters is the weight of the thing you're riding toward. Grant pulled onto the county road with the headlight cutting east through the dark. Behind him, 200 bikes. The farm appeared in his headlight at 4 miles exactly. A compound rather than a farm, he understood in the first second, the kind of property that had been purchased for its isolation and its acreage rather than for any agricultural purpose. The buildings functional and anonymous, the fencing newer than it looked in the dark. And the lights. Lights on in a low structure at the back of the compound that would have been invisible from the road at any other time of night, but which were burning now with the frantic illumination of people in the process of moving things in a hurry. 2 vehicles at the gate, men in civilian clothes who were not farmers. Behind Grant, 200 headlights came over the rise in the road, like dawn arriving from the wrong direction. The men at the gate looked at those lights, looked at each other. One of them reached for a radio. Grant killed his engine and let the bike roll to a stop 20 feet from the gate, in the sudden relative silence of 200 other engines, also going quiet, and the night filled with nothing but rain and the creak of the compound's front gate, and the distant sound from the low back building of something that might have been, if you were listening for it, a child's voice calling a name. His own voice. From inside the compound, from behind a locked door in a structure that smelled like containment and looked like nothing and held, according to Kellen's own words, people who were not under county control. Grant looked at the gate. He looked at the men in front of it. He looked at 200 Rooks fanned out behind him across the width of the county road, engines dead, phones up, recording everything the headlights touched. Then from inside the compound, from the low back building, a sound cut through the rain that Grant had been a combat medic long enough to know was not ambiguous, was not interpretable in multiple ways, was not anything except what it was. A child screaming, and every hand on every throttle on that road tightened at the same. The gate came down, not broken, unlatched. One of the men in civilian clothes at the front of the compound looked at 200 headlights and made the specific calculation that his employment did not extend to dying for it, and he stepped aside and pushed the gate open with the deliberate movement of a man who has decided that the most important thing he can do right now is make himself irrelevant to whatever happens next. The second man was on a radio. Moose, who had appeared from the east side of the road on foot, hands still showing faint marks from the flex cuffs, moving with the particular energy of a large person who has been sitting in a holding room for 4 hours accumulating a very specific kind of focus, walked up to him and took the radio out of his hand without discussion. "How?" Grant said, not stopping. "Back door," Moose said, falling into step. "Somebody left it unsupported." "Somebody?" Deacon's very quiet for a big man. Grant was already through the gate and moving across the compound toward the low back building where the lights were burning and the sound had come from, and behind him the Rooks came through in a controlled flood. Not running, not chaotic, but moving with the collective purposefulness of people who had made their decision at the gate and were now executing it, spreading across the compound with phones up and eyes open, and the long-practiced instinct of men who had learned to secure a space without being told how. The low building had 2 doors. Grant took the near one. It was unlocked. They had been in the process of moving, which meant things had been opened that wouldn't otherwise be open. And inside was a corridor that smelled exactly like the clinic corridor had smelled, disinfectant over the thing that disinfectant couldn't cover. And the lights here were battery emergency yellow, the facility's main power having been cut or tripped sometime in the last 10 minutes, which explained the frantic illumination Grant had seen from the road. 3 doors on the left, 2 on the right, all with the same additional hardware as the clinic's east wing. From behind the second door on the left, a voice. Small, trying not to be loud and not fully succeeding. Grant tried the handle. Locked. He looked at the door frame, the hardware, the specific model of secondary lock, and reached into his jacket for the tool set he carried. In the same habit as the trauma kit, not always needed, always present, and had it open in 40 seconds while Juno stood behind him with a flashlight held steady without being asked. The door opened. 4 children, ages approximately 6 through 12, seated against the back wall with the specific stillness of people who had learned that stillness was the safest available option. A woman, late 30s, thin in the way of someone who had been surviving rather than living for an extended period, hair that had once been carefully kept, was positioned in front of them with her arms out, the instinctive geometry of a person placing their body between their children and whatever was coming through the door. Grant stopped in the doorway. He kept his hands visible. He kept his voice at the register of the back corner booth at June's diner, the same register he'd used when he sat down across from a 10-year-old girl who was calculating whether he was a threat. "We're not going to hurt you," he said. "My name is Grant. We're here to get you out." The woman's arms stayed up. "There's a road outside," Grant said. "There are 200 people on that road who are not county employees and are not connected to anyone who brought you here. I need you to walk with me." The woman looked at him, then at Juno behind him with the flashlight, then at the patches on their jackets, the Thunder Rooks cut, the worn leather, the specific texture of men who carried damage visibly and hadn't bothered to hide it. She lowered her arms, not because she trusted them, because she had run the calculation the same way Ava had run it in the diner, the same way every person in that building had learned to run calculations, rapidly, on incomplete information, under pressure, and had arrived at the only available option that wasn't what they already had. "My children," she said. Her voice was the voice of someone who had been conserving it. "I see them," Grant said. "They come with you." The other rooms yielded 4 more people, 2 women and 2 children, all in the same state of provisional stillness, all with the same first response of covering whatever was behind them before looking at who had opened the door. Grant moved through each room with the same voice, the same cadence, the same visible hands. Juno documented everything: the room dimensions, the door hardware, the bedding, the water containers, the clipboard on the wall outside each room that listed names and assigned numbers and check-in/checkout times in the bureaucratic language of a system that had been running long enough to develop its own administrative grammar. On the clipboard outside the last room, at the top of the list, a heart, N heart, transfer, pending, Grant stood in the yellow emergency light and looked at that line for 3 seconds. Then he turned to Juno. The barn at the back. Deacon's people? Securing it now. There's documentation in there, Grant. Physical files. A lot of them. Nobody touches them. We photograph everything in place and we leave the physical files for the investigators. He moved back toward the door. Where are Ava and Noah? Juno's expression shifted. They weren't in these rooms. Grant stopped. The transfer manifest in the clinic. It had them as pending, not complete. But they were moved from the clinic before we got the rooms open. Cord's been trying to track the second tunnel exit. It comes up approximately... Juno checked his phone. 200 meters north-northeast of the compound. Open field. There's a vehicle road through the back of the adjacent property. Grant was already outside. The field north of the compound was flat and wet, the grass knee-height and soaked, and the vehicle road Juno had described was 2 tire tracks pressed into the earth that were currently full of standing rainwater. The tracks went northeast toward a tree line. Grant followed them at a run, which was not a thing his body was entirely happy about at 4:50 in the morning after the night it had experienced, and he ran anyway. Cord met him at the tree line. Cord was breathing hard, which meant Cord had also been running, and Cord was 58 years old, which meant the situation had warranted it. Vehicle went through here, Cord said, pointing to the tracks continuing into the trees. Maybe 20 minutes ago. Maybe less. Headed to the county road, East Junction. How do you know it's them? Cord held up his flashlight. On the ground at the edge of the tree line, half pressed into the mud by the passage of a tire, was a child's sneaker. Left foot. Sole separated at the toe. Noah's shoe. Grant took it from Cord's hand and looked at it, and the cold that had nothing to do with temperature moved through him one more time, deep and specific. The cold of understanding that a small boy who had been carried or dragged through a muddy field in the dark had lost a shoe and probably hadn't been able to stop to pick it up. Which way east? Grant said. Junction splits. North goes to the highway, south goes back toward town. Grant calculated. If they were running, the whole operation was in collapse. The documentation was transmitted. The compound was compromised. The county system had failed to contain the situation. If they were running, they were not going south toward a town that was now occupied by 200 bikers and actively being documented. They were going north, to the highway, to whatever exit plan had been prepared for exactly this contingency. He was back through the tree line and on his bike before Cord had finished the sentence. He rode north on the East Junction Road with no one behind him. No time to pull additional riders, no time to explain the route. Just the single headlight and the rain and the tire tracks that were still fresh enough to catch the light, where the mud at the road's edge held their impression, following the tracks the way you follow anything you've been given, only one chance to follow, with the total attention of a person who understands that stopping is not an option. The vehicle was a quarter-mile from the highway junction. It had gone off the road, not crashed, controlled, pulled to the shoulder deliberately, and was sitting with its engine running and its lights on and the driver's door open in the way that means someone got out in a hurry. Grant came to a stop 30 feet back and killed his engine, and in the sudden silence he heard voices. Off the road's east shoulder, in the high grass, 10 feet from the drainage ditch. He dismounted and walked toward the voices, and the scene assembled itself from the dark. Ray Calder, on his knees in the wet grass, with his hands held out from his sides in the posture of a man who has been told very clearly to keep them there. Behind him, standing in the grass with the focused attention of someone who has been trained to hold a position, was Juno's second rider, a woman named Petra, former Army MP, who had taken the East Intercept route based on a prediction that Grant had not yet articulated, but which Petra had apparently reached independently and acted on, which was the quality about Petra that made her invaluable. Beside Ray, standing close together, not touching anything, were Ava and Noah Hart. Ava was looking at Grant across 10 feet of wet grass in the dark, with the expression of a person seeing the verification of something they had decided to believe against considerable evidence. Not relief. That would come later, if it came, when the body and mind had time to process the distance between what had been happening and what was happening now. Not joy. Something quieter and more structural. The expression of a thing that had been held under pressure for a long time being allowed, with caution, to begin to release. Noah had found Grant's face and was not looking away. Grant walked to them. He crouched down in the wet grass so he was at eye level with Noah, and he looked at the boy, and the boy was shaking. Cold, fear, both, neither, the body expressing what language couldn't carry. And Grant said nothing for a moment. He just looked at Noah and let Noah look back. Then he took off his jacket and put it around the boy's shoulders, and the jacket was enormous and swallowed Noah entirely. And Noah put his hands through the sleeves anyway and held the front of it closed, and Grant thought about the shoe in his pocket and decided that could wait until they were somewhere dry. "You're cold," Grant said. "Yeah," Noah said. His voice was very small. "We're going to fix that," Grant said. He stood up and looked at Ava. She was dry-eyed and straight-backed and had her arms crossed the way she always held herself, compressed, self-contained, minimizing her own surface area against a world that had consistently given her reasons to do so. She was looking at him with the evaluating directness she'd had since the diner, since the first moment she'd decided to pass the keycard. "Your mom," Grant said. Something moved across Ava's face. "She's at the compound," Grant said. "She's safe. Rooks are with her right now." Ava's arms dropped. It was the smallest possible movement, the compressed posture releasing by a single degree. And it lasted only a second before her composure reasserted itself. But Grant caught it and filed it in the same category as Noah's flinch and the shoe in the mud, the category of things that told you everything about what a person had been carrying. "Okay," Ava said. Her voice was steady. "Okay," Grant said. He picked up Noah. The boy didn't resist, just went with it. A small person who had used up the available reserves and was willing, for this specific moment, to be carried, and walked back toward the road. The rest came apart the way things come apart when their structural integrity has been fundamentally compromised. Not dramatically, not in a single clean break, but in the progressive failures of a system that no longer had the protection it had operated under. By 6 a.m, state law enforcement had arrived at 2 entry points into Garlow County, responding to the documentation Juno had transmitted and the ancillary calls that had gone out from 2 journalists who had opened their inboxes earlier than expected. By 7, federal contacts had been notified at the level that initiates a different category of response. The farm compound, the clinic, the records annex, and the station were all sealed under state authority by 7:40, the county deputies standing aside with the specific passivity of men who had understood in the last 2 hours that the structure they'd been operating within was no longer capable of protecting them. Sheriff Kellen was arrested at 8:15 in his own parking lot. He didn't resist. He walked to the state vehicle with his hands already out, and when the investigator asked him to confirm his identity for the record, he did so in a voice that contained no argument, no protest. The voice of a man who had known this particular morning was a possibility for years and had been building the contingency that delayed it rather than the decision that prevented it. Deputy Harlan broke before noon. That was the word that came back through channels. Broke, which is what people say when they mean that a person stopped protecting a thing and started telling the truth about it, which in Harlan's case took approximately 4 hours of state-level interview and produced enough supplementary documentation to extend the investigation into 3 adjacent counties. Ray Calder was processed and charged by 9 a.m. The documentation from the compound and the clinic sufficient to initiate federal-level charges that went considerably beyond Garlow County's jurisdiction. Grant heard all of this secondhand, in pieces, over the course of a morning spent at June's diner. The Rooks had occupied every available space in the building again. Not the chaotic overflow of the storm night, but a settled, quieter presence. People who had been through something together and were existing in the specific stillness that follows an extended crisis. Coffee was continuously present. The grill was going. June moved through the room with the same efficient grace, refilling cups without being asked, not speaking unless spoken to, her entire manner communicating the particular form of care that expresses itself through logistics and proximity rather than words. The woman from the compound, her name was Leah Hart, Ava and Noah's mother, sat in a booth near the window with both children pressed against her sides. She hadn't spoken much. There wasn't much to say yet. The saying would come later, in the careful, incremental way that people approach things that have been too large for too long. For now, she sat with her arms around her children and occasionally pressed her face against the top of Ava's head and breathed. Moose sat 3 booths down with his own coffee and a plate of eggs he was eating slowly, his wrists resting on the table with the faint marks from the flex cuffs still visible. He had not complained about the arrest, the holding room, or the condition of the county jail's coffee, which was either stoicism or the focused calm of a man who had determined that the situation had resolved in an acceptable direction and did not require retrospective grievance. Grant sat at the counter. He sat the way he always sat in the aftermath of something, quietly, with coffee going cold in front of him, running the inventory of the last 12 hours with the detached professional attention of a medic reviewing a case. What had been done correctly? What had been done in the margins of correct? What had been done entirely on instinct and had somehow produced the necessary outcome anyway? Deacon sat beside him. He hadn't said much since the compound either. That was the nature of their particular friendship. Long silences that weren't uncomfortable. Conversation that started in the middle rather than at the beginning, because they'd been through enough together to have established the shared foundation that most people spent the first half of a conversation building. "The documentation's in federal hands," Deacon said. "Yeah. They're going to want statements from all of us." "I know." Deacon turned his coffee cup in his hands. "We entered that clinic without authorization. We accessed a protected system. We're going to have some exposure here." "Probably." "Probably," Deacon repeated, with the tone of a man noting that this was a significant understatement. "You've thought about that." "Since the parking lot." "And?" Grant looked at the counter, at the coffee, at his own hands, which were the hands of a man who had been a medic and then been other things, and was now sitting in a diner at 7:30 in the morning, having made a decision in a parking lot the previous night that had led here, to this specific moment, to a woman breathing against her daughter's hair 3 booths away. "Yeah," Grant said. Deacon nodded. He picked up his coffee. "Okay then." That was the entire conversation. The state investigator came to the diner at 8:45. She was 40, precise, with the economy of movement of someone who had worked long-term cases and understood that urgency and haste were related but not identical. She sat across from Grant in a corner booth and asked her questions in the order that made structural sense, and Grant answered them completely and accurately, including the parts that were legally uncomfortable, because incomplete answers now would create investigative gaps that could be exploited later by defense attorneys representing people Grant had no interest in providing assistance to. It took an hour and 20 minutes. When it was done, the investigator closed her notebook and looked at Grant with an expression that was professionally neutral and contained beneath the neutrality something that was not quite approval. Approval was the wrong category, but was the acknowledgement of a person who has encountered a situation that required someone to act and is processing the fact that someone did. She said, "Your people are going to need to stay available." "We will," Grant said. She looked at the diner, the Rooks, the families, June behind the counter, the particular ecosystem that had assembled itself here over the past several hours. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "It wasn't an assessment. It was an observation." "No," Grant agreed. She stood up and left. Cord was outside on the steps when Grant came out for air. The old man was sitting on the railing with his jacket open despite the cold, because Cord ran warm and always had. He had a cigarette going, the rare kind, the kind he saved for certain specific moments. And he was looking at the county road in the early morning light with the expression of a man reviewing something private. Grant leaned against the wall. "You know what I keep thinking about," Cord said. "What?" She wrote that note before she sat down. He took a slow drag. 10 years old. She sat down in a room full of bikers and she already had it ready. She already knew what she was going to do. "Well," Grant said nothing. "That's not a child who just hoped someone would notice," Cord said. "That's a child who made a plan." He exhaled. "How many times do you think she made that plan before?" Grant looked at the road. Clean in the morning light, the rain gone, the asphalt dark and wet and empty in both directions. "Too many," he said. Cord nodded. He finished the cigarette and pressed it out on the railing with the same care he applied to everything mechanical and fragile. "We did right," he said. Not a question, not reassurance, a statement, made to the road in the morning and whatever accounting a 58-year-old man makes in the quiet after a long night. "Yeah," Grant said. They stood there for a while without talking, Inside, through the diner window, Grant could see Moose at his booth, could see that Noah had migrated from his mother's side and was now sitting across from Moose, watching Moose eat with the focused attention of a small person who has identified a large, non-threatening presence and is cautiously investigating its properties. Moose was ignoring this with elaborate patience. Then he pushed his plate of toast across the table without comment. Noah took a piece. Moose returned to his eggs. Grant watched that through the window for a moment. He went back inside. He stopped at Leah Hart's booth. She looked up at him with the eyes of a woman who was simultaneously exhausted and somewhere near the beginning of something that would take a long time and require more than she currently had and would nevertheless be necessary to do. She had the specific focus of a person in the early stages of reconstituting themselves after an extended period of having that process disrupted externally. There are organizations, Grant said, people who help with what comes next. Housing, legal representation, counseling. I can get you names. Leah looked at him. Why did you come after us? She said. Not accusatory, genuine. Grant thought about the napkin, about the block letters, about a 10-year-old's precise handwriting in the back corner of a diner booth, the note placed under the edge of a plate with the calculation of someone who had thought through exactly where to put it so it wouldn't be seen until she was gone. Your daughter, he said, trusted me with everything she had. Leah's expression moved through several things. Ava was watching him from her mother's side with the dark eyes that moved too fast, cataloging, always cataloging. The sleeves of her borrowed jacket were pulled down over her hands. Grant met her eyes and held them. You did good, he said to her directly. Ava looked at him for a long moment. Something behind her eyes worked through a calculation he couldn't read. Then she said, in the same quiet voice she'd used in the booth the first time, You came back. I said I would. She hadn't said anything else, but she nodded once. Small, deliberate, the nod of someone filing information in the correct category, and looked back at her mother. The Thunder Rooks began to pull out from Garlow County in the late morning, after the statements were given and the investigators had what they needed and the families from the compound had been transferred to the care of the State Services liaison, who had arrived with a van and a stack of intake forms, and the brisk, competent warmth of someone who had done this work long enough to do it well. They left in groups, not all at once. The full departure of 200 motorcycles is a thing that needs to be managed in a town that has already had a complicated 12 hours. They rolled out by section, Cord's group first, then Deacon's, then the others, until the June's Diner parking lot had cleared down to a dozen bikes, and then 6, and then just Grant's, alone on the gravel. He stood beside it for a while. The morning was the particular clean that comes after a storm has fully passed. The air washed, the light returning without apology, the road ahead holding the last of the rain in puddles that would be gone by noon. Somewhere in the adjacent counties, investigators were working through documentation that would occupy the legal system for the better part of the next year. Kellen was in processing, Harlan was talking, Ray Calder was in federal custody. The system that had run through clinics and tunnels and county records for 14 documented months had its last morning of operation somewhere around 4:40 on a rural road where a small boy lost a shoe in the mud. Grant put the shoe on the step of June's Diner before he left. He didn't know why exactly. It felt like it belonged somewhere specific rather than in his jacket pocket, and the step felt right, visible, in the light, not lost. He mounted up. The engine fired on the first attempt, which Cord would have taken as a good omen if Cord believed in omens, which he didn't, but which felt like something anyway. Grant pulled onto the county road and pointed north and rode. The town fell away behind him, then the county. Then the long, flat stretch of route that ran between the fields and the sky, with nothing on either side but the particular American emptiness that was sometimes bleak and sometimes just honest. Just the world as it was without anything added, the stripped-down version of a landscape that didn't require decoration. The Thunder Rooks were somewhere ahead on the highway. He could find them by sound before he found them by sight. 200 engines carrying their cumulative frequency through the air like a chord, like the low register of something that had no other name but here and moving and together. He didn't push to catch them. He rode his own pace and let the road do what roads do. He thought about Ava's face in the booth, the first time when she'd decided he wasn't a threat in 2 seconds and passed him a napkin. The last time when she'd said you came back with the specific weight of a person for whom coming back was not a thing that could be assumed. He thought about Noah's shoe in his jacket pocket, and then on the diner step, and what it meant that a 6-year-old had kept moving through a muddy field in the dark with one bare foot because stopping was not an option available to him. He thought about that boy eating toast across from Moose with the careful focus of someone investigating whether large, non-threatening things were real. He thought about what it would take for that investigation to conclude in the affirmative, and how long it would take, and whether that was enough. He didn't have answers to any of it. That was the honest reality of the morning. Not resolution in the clean narrative sense, not the sense of a completed accounting, but the sense of a thing having been done that was worth doing, and the people it had been done for still existing in the world, which was the most fundamental possible outcome and the only one that mattered. The highway opened in front of him. Somewhere up ahead, 200 Harleys were already singing. Grant opened the throttle and went to meet them. This story is a work of fiction created entirely for cinematic and entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, motorcycle clubs, and organizations depicted are fictional and bear no resemblance to any real persons, places, or entities.